Okay. All right, let's jump in. Thanks everybody for joining today. My name is Seth Foreman. I'm the CEO at Social Suite. Companies around the world are grappling with an array of forces driving sustainability action, ranging from regulations to customer-driven requirements to investor needs, and for many, many other reasons. And regardless of the driver of your sustainability approach, it's critical that companies start their journey conducting a materiality assessment, which leads to the main topic of today's webinar: which type of materiality assessment is the right approach for your company? So, now for those unfamiliar with Social Suite, we're a global materiality management platform offering simple and cost-effective solutions to run financial, impact, and/or double materiality assessments. Our unique approach, combining materiality technology with expert sector-driven advisors, helps our customers drive results and create value back to their organizations. Now, we do a lot of different types of content, and we know how complex sustainability can be for companies. We continue to produce all different types of high quality information to ensure our audiences have all the most up-to-date information on regulations and best practices across a whole number of different sustainability-based topics. Please make sure to take a look. If you go onto our website, you could find sections on our different webinars, our white papers, and other information to help you keep up to date on everything happening across the world of sustainability. And now just jumping into some housekeeping items before we get started. The content of today's webinar will last approximately 30 minutes, and then we're going to hold a Q&A session. So if you have any questions or comments during the webinar, feel free to ask them directly into the chat section on the right side of your screen. And our host today, Tim, can actually in real time answer them, or we'll get to it at the Q&A session. And today's webinar will be recorded, and we'll be sending out the webinar soon after at the conclusion of the webinar today. So without further ado, I do want to introduce today's host, Dr. Tim Siegevik Van Hukelum, the Chief Impact Officer at Social Suite, and I will pass the baton over to Tim to take it from here. I'm going to leave the chat so that Tim can run through the content, and I'll come back for Q&A. Thanks so much.
Excellent. Thanks, Seth, for that introduction, and welcome everyone. Looking forward to talk with you today about materiality and selecting the right materiality assessment approach. So to do that, we'll have to define materiality in a little bit of detail. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it's really important to get that quick intro on what materiality really means in the sustainability realm. After that, we'll jump into the different approaches, the drivers, around doing a materiality assessment and what type of approaches we see companies take. And then finally, we'll look at some key considerations to ask yourself. What are the things to think about and ask yourself to understand what your drivers are and what approaches might be most suitable for your business? So we'll work our way through this content. And like Seth said, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat. I'll try to address them as we go, or we'll leave them to the end if they're better suited to get back at the end of the webinar at the Q&A. So first of all, then a quick introduction into materiality. Now, materiality really is about defining the most significant sustainability issues that are impacting your company, so from a financial point of view, but also how the company is impacting its stakeholders at large. And think about stakeholders as the external world, so people, planet, society. So that's at a very high level. And it's worth unpacking that a little bit more. Because in the sustainability realm, we generally hear about three types of materiality. We hear about financial materiality, we hear about impact materiality, and we hear about double materiality. Now, it's worth looking at that in a little bit more detail to fully understand how materiality works, because later that will help us understand more around the drivers and more around the approaches we might be taking. So when we start with financial materiality, that is where we're looking at what are those key sustainability matters that are reasonably likely to pose risks or opportunities to our financial position. now or in the short, medium, or long term. So it's really about thinking risks and opportunities to our business coming forth out of a sustainability matter. And I'll be using that terminology, sustainability matter, throughout the webinar. And what I really mean with that, it's a particular environmental, social, or governance issue or topic. So think about it as it could be workforce health and safety. It could be biodiversity. It could be GHG emissions. It could be on the governance side about tax transparency or business ethics. So there's many ESG topics that we could define as a sustainability matter. So all of them could be in some way, shape, or form pose a risk or an opportunity to your business. Now, if we look at the other side of that, we can also look at how are sustainability matters, looking at an organization's impact on the environmental, social, and economic side. So what it really means is, how is our business impacting the outside world, our stakeholders at large? So we could be thinking GHG emissions, how many emissions are we creating and how is that contributing to climate change? We could be thinking about how safe our operations, are we potentially negatively impacting the health and well-being of our construction workers, etc. So it's really about what are the impacts that you're having around a particular sustainability matter. So we have impacts, risks, and opportunities. Now, we could be looking at one angle or the other, and that is what we've seen traditionally from a more kind of financial materiality point of view. We see that the ISSB with their IFRS S1 standard and S2 standards, they're really looking at what are the risks and opportunities to the business. If you're familiar with the Global Reporting Initiative, they really look at more at impact materiality. So how is your company impacting the world? And when we bring those two perspectives together, the union of impact and financial materiality, that is what we call double materiality. And that is quite an important concept because we see that now in the European Union with our Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, CSRD and ESRS. It is a mandated concept. You have to do a materiality assessment and it needs to be a double materiality assessment. So to put this in a little bit more context again, this is how you can look at it. There's the world and how is that impacting the business. So that's financial materiality. And we're looking then for financial risks and opportunities. So for each of those risks and opportunities, we do want to look at what is the magnitude and the probability of this risk or this opportunity. And if we're looking at how is our business impacting the world, impact materiality, we're looking for negative and positive impacts. And we want to understand if there are potential actual and what is the severity and the likelihood of those impacts. And if it's a negative impact, what's the level of irremediability for that particular negative impact? Together, if we look at both perspectives, again, that is double materiality. So we're looking at what are the impacts, what are the risks, and what are the opportunities. Now we need to look at that, and this might look a little complex, but what we're trying to do here is give you a generalized view of a value chain. So we're really looking here at a company in the green box here with its business activities, its own operations, but there's also a supply chain or upstream as we might call it. So it's all the things where you might be sourcing products or services, the things that happen before it gets to your own operations, and then all the things downstream where you have your off-takers, your customers, the product and services, where do they end up? What is the end of life there? Across that full value chain, we need to identify where do those sustainability related impacts, risks and opportunities, where do they sit? Really, it's about mapping that out, really understanding where they live and what sustainability matters they're related to. And we often see that impacts can sit everywhere and they're often the drivers for a lot of risk and opportunities. That's why we see that a lot of companies start with identifying impacts and then get to associated risks and opportunities. But there might also be critical dependencies that are a risk that are not per se linked to an impact or opportunities that sit on them themselves. But there's a lot of interactions between impact, risks, and opportunities. And that's why we see more and more that double materiality is becoming really a best practice to look at. But people say you need to look at both perspectives. Now, how does that then translate into the real world? So there was a lot of theory, and we often get companies and people that say, well, that's all great, your diagrams, but how does that actually translate to something that makes a bit more sense? So we got 4 examples here to look at that importance of understanding materiality and linking it back to those concepts of impact, risk, and opportunities around a particular sustainability matter. So we had a dependency risk where Porsche had a profit warning early in the year when there was a big kind of climate event in Europe. There were a lot of flooding in Germany, and it really was hitting the aluminium supplier. So they were having a big issue there. There's a critical dependency, and there was a topic there, climate change and the physical impacts of climate change, a lot of storms, a lot of rain there, that was impacting their business. So financial materiality point of view there. So this is all about identifying those particular dependency risks and protecting your business from that. If we look at another risk, this is more of a stakeholder risk, and we see that this has played out more recently really across the US, where companies have been dropping diversity, equity, and inclusion targets and programs, really coming from pressure from stakeholder groups. So there were some misaligned stakeholder expectations where there was not enough engagement with stakeholders. What do they really care about? There was some pressure from particular stakeholder groups there. So by understanding your stakeholders and engaging with them, you can mitigate that risk that you kind of misalign your sustainability focus and the programs that you implement with what stakeholders are actually looking for. On a more positive note then, you can have some positive impacts as well. And that often comes together with, still driving profit. You can drive profit and have positive impacts at the same time. And in this case, we see a good example from a logistics companies that is really helping a lot of aid and relief operations in conflict and disaster zones to really get goods, products, services for NGOs and United Nations agencies to help save lives and support communities in those zones where there's a really high need there. And then there's some financial opportunities. We need to really make sure we don't always just focus on risk, really think about opportunities as well when we look at markets and see their different trends and movements in the market. So in this case, plant-based ingredients and products is a big market segment that's growing, and this company is really looking at that to find business opportunities that help their business, but in this case, that also benefit nature and people there. So this might be linked to a positive impact there as well. So this is really trying to make materiality a bit more real in that sense. So with that introduction, I think it is then good to look at what are some common drivers and approaches around doing a materiality assessment. And the 2 common drivers for conducting a materiality assessment, the one is more I would say a reactive approach. You'll become aware that there is some requirement that you need to do a materiality assessment that might come out of a ESG or sustainability standard or framework. Already spoke about some of them. We spoke about the ISSB. They have the IFRS S1, which is focused on financial materiality. Spoke about GRI, it's focused on impact materiality, and in the European Union, CSRD, double materiality. We also see organizations like B Corp in their certification. They have some version of impact materiality. So it could be a lot of more certification standards and legislation. If we think about CSRD or the implementation of the IFRS standards, which are now being implemented. For instance, in Canada, IFRS S1 is being implemented as CSDS 1. In Australia, it's ASRS S1. So we see there's implementation there, whereas the IFRS standard is a voluntary global standard. We see jurisdictions implementing that and making that a requirement then for companies. So there could be a more kind of standard or legislative driven requirement there to do a materiality assessment, but it could also come from your stakeholders or investors that say, we don't want all your sustainability information, we just want what is material. So do that materiality assessment and tell us on those most kind of important topics, the material topics, make disclosures there. On the other end, there is more, I would say, the proactive way of looking at it. And we often see those 2 drivers combined, the requirement and the strategic value, but there's also a good reason to think more strategically about doing a materiality assessment, because it really can help you inform your strategy. It can help you focus your operations. So the implementation of your sustainability strategy. If you know what's important to the business and you know what your 3-year strategy is, you also know on a day-to-day business, where should we focus our resources and that could be human resources, it could be financial resources. What is most important to our stakeholders, and where can we make a difference in terms of being more cleaner, greener, efficient from a sustainability point of view? And ultimately then, if you do that, you want to disclose your sustainability performance. So that goes to reporting. So what we might see, for example, is that you might say, there's a requirement on me to do a double materiality assessment, but in doing that, it also helps me to refresh my sustainability strategy, which is due. It helps me focus on really driving sustainable practice, and it helps me report on relevant standards. And that could be Europe, it could be the CSRD, or it could be GRI or B Corp certification. So it's really important to look at those drivers and think about, what do I have to do, the requirements, and how can I leverage the strategic value that I might get out of doing a materiality assessment. And looking at that, I think that strategic component is really important, because what we do see, there's a lot of drivers for companies to really focus on reporting these days. So that is where they come in. I need to report, there's a requirement. I need to do a materiality assessment to figure out what I need to measure, collect data on, disclose, and get assurance over. Forgetting that in the end, reporting is really, like I said, it is about disclosing your performance on sustainability. And if you don't have a focus on execution, on the practice of doing things, of really looking at that operational excellence, having policies, programs, and initiatives that make your organization more sustainable and responsible, and to make sure that that is a focused effort as well, where the strategy component comes in, then you keep reporting every year over and over the same things. And you don't really have a clear view on strategically what is your long-term plan, what are you trying to achieve, what objectives and targets have you set, and governance and oversight mechanisms do you have, and how does it translate on an operational level. So there's three elements are really important. And to that point, there's a strong focus now on sustainability reporting. We see that a lot these days, where it's all about reporting, and we often see companies mostly forget about that practice. What are you actually doing on a day-to-day basis? How have you embedded or made sustainability part of the organizations, part of business as usual? It should not be something that sits on one person's desk, an ESG lead that is just doing the reporting, spends most of their time on that, and no one else cares about sustainability. It's about really looking at it as a similar thing like financial reporting. Every department will have their budget, or budget lines. We'll be looking at that throughout the year. Sustainability needs to be embedded in a similar fashion. Now, after the drivers, let's look at the approach. We already spoke about, if you think about approach, we spoke about you might want to do a financial materiality assessment or an impact materiality assessment, or moving closer to best practice is doing that double materiality assessment, looking at both perspectives there. But there's a broad range of ways of doing that. And what we see is there's some simpler versions to very more deep engagement approaches. And we see companies often, not always, kind of move gradually. They start with a simpler version and then move over time when they understand what's required, either from a legislative point of view, what they have to do at some point, or what your stakeholders need, and building internal capacity to really improve on this. And the simplest version, which is hard to actually call a real materiality assessment, but it does happen a lot, is more what we'd like to call the captain's call. It's a discretionary decision that we see happening in organizations sometimes, where board director or C-suite member says, well, we know what's important here, the 5 or the 10 topics that are important, they're material, let's report on it. So it's just a call by someone who says, I know best what's important. It's not really a materiality assessment per se, but you might have some topics that gives you some focus. If we move from there, you get more internal discussion. So you see there are more people involved internally. It could be a few more people, it could be a working group. You see often at this level, it might be driven by investor focus, financial materiality. We need to identify some topics we'll report on. And if we move a little bit further to the right to more engagement and deeper approach, we see there's more of that external component coming in there. Engaging with external stakeholders to get their views. How are we affecting them with negative impacts? What are some risks and opportunities we might not be aware of, and how are they linked to potential impact? So we're adding that component of stakeholder engagement, both internally and externally. And from there on, we're moving more towards that double materiality assessment. where we really kind of look at going deeper, looking more from topics. Sometimes we see materiality assessment really focus on the topics itself, but as we've seen, the topics are often kind of linked back to those impact, risks, and opportunities, and they are really important to identify. So yes, you can focus on topics and ask your stakeholders how important is animal welfare to you, but it's more kind of insightful for an organization to really understand how are we impacting animal welfare, or what are some risks around that for our business. So it's really moving towards the more impact, risks, and opportunities, IROs-led practices across your full value chain. And ultimately there, when you start doing that work and following the rules that they have set in the European Union, it will be compliant with CSRD and ESRS. So there's a whole spectrum there, from simple to deep engagement and kind of really more elaborate approaches there. And it's really important for your business to find, meet the business where it's at, find the right approach in terms of what you have to do from a legislative point of view. How does it help you from a strategic point of view as well? Like sometimes you might only need to do financial materiality from a legislative point of view, but if you do that exercise, you might as well make it a double materiality assessment, because there's a lot of additional benefits you might gain from that. Let's look at some considerations. Well, then, if we're going to go through that process, you might have figured out, I want to do one of these approaches there. What are you going to do, and what are the key considerations to ask yourself about selecting that right materiality approach? And I think there's three key kind of things to ask yourself. The first one is around expertise. Do we know why and what we're doing? So that goes back to that point I made around requirements. Do we know the requirements, and do we know why we're doing this? So what's the reason to do this materiality assessment? What are we going to do? And do we actually then, if we know what we're going to do, how that works, what the process should look like? So there's quite a few things packed here into expertise, but it's really important to ask yourself that question. The next one then is, who's actually going to lead this effort? So do we have resources in the business that can do this work? It's linked back to expertise. And if they can do the work in terms of time and resources, do they also know what they need to do? Do they have the expertise? And do we need support? And it could be internal support to make sure that throughout the business, we don't get that captain score view where your ESG lead is just picking some topics, but they actually engage with the business. And they actually get the support potentially around expertise. What should they be doing? What does the process look like? So it's really important to figure out internally and externally who's leading and who's supporting the actual materiality assessment. And then finally, which tools do we need for the job? And that is a really important question as well, because there might be a lot of work you need to do in figuring out what topics you're going to use, what stakeholders you're going to engage with, how you're going to engage with them, how are you going to capture all the data is coming back, how are you going to do scoring on particular topics or on impacts, risks, and opportunities. All that work needs to be done, managed, and there are tools required to do that. So some key things to ask yourself, and let's run through three quick examples there of what that might look like and where you might, have clear ideas and where you might get stuck. So the first example might be, as I flagged earlier, it might be, it's clear we need to run an IFRS S1 financial materiality assessment, and that might then be a investor requirement. So it is IFRS S1 because that is not a mandated standard. It's just a voluntary standard that anyone can use globally. But like we said, we do see jurisdictions implement that. So there are definitely a lot of jurisdictions that have implemented either directly IFRS S1 or made it into their own standard, and sounds very similar like in Canada and in Australia. That's what we need to do. That's clear. The lead, we have a chief sustainability officer who's going to lead the effort. We'll get support from our chief financial officer and our chief risk officer because we know the risks. We're looking at the materiality from a financial point of view. So we will use some of the existing thresholds that the CFO is normally using in financial accounting. So we have a clear team there. And how we're going to do this? Well, we use spreadsheets. We'll have a workshop with the C-suite to work out what are the existing risks in the business, what do we need to add from a sustainability point of view, and how does that then translate into financial, material risks and opportunities from a sustainability point of view. So in this case, might be pretty clear there, and a strong internal exercise there to get a clear view on what are the financial material topics for your business. But there might be other scenarios where you do know there is a requirement for a strategy refresh. So the head of ESG in a business has been given the task to update our ESG or sustainability strategy. Maybe the board's mandated that, but the head of ESG is not entirely sure what the right type of assessment would be to do to inform that strategy. Well, we know that the materiality assessment will give you some focus, but is it better to do financial or impact or double materiality? So we might not be clear there yet. And with that as well, we might be in a situation here where the head of ESG is really more siloed to the organization, or if it's ESG or sustainability, we'll just throw it at your desk and it's your problem from there on. So there's not much of an embedded approach there. So it might be pretty tricky then to kind of drive that process in the organization to get the buy-in and the support and the inputs that you need to go through that assessment. And then what tools are you using? Likely spreadsheet will be used to manage the process and the data. And then finally, we might have a European company in the European Union that's like, well, we have to do this. We need to start reporting on the CSRD, on the ESRS. So we have to do a double materiality assessment as outlined by ESRS. We have a chief sustainability officer. We have a cross-functional ESG committee that already exists in the business. So the CSO will be leading. We have that committee to support the effort. And you might even here get a consultant in to, help the effort, help you work out the interpretation of what CSRD as a new kind of legislation, what it really requires, and to do it well. How are you going to do the job? Spreadsheets, maybe an online survey tool, get it all together. Now we have 3 scenarios here. You see there's different ways, and it's really about asking those questions and really thinking about what is applicable to my situation. What do I need to do or want to do, and why am I doing that? Who's going to do it? And then what are we going to use? But there's one common denominator that we've seen here, and that is in the tools. Everyone is using spreadsheets. And that is something that we've seen a lot. There's a lot of anecdotal insights that we have on technology use. As a technology company, of course, we speak to a lot of practitioners and a lot of CSOs and heads of ESG that have done materiality assessments, are running them right now. And the majority, 90%, if not more, say, oh, it's all in Excel. It's all in spreadsheets. Now, with that, we also hear from them that most of them agree that using spreadsheets for materiality assessment is a necessary evil. It's the only thing we've got, but it is far from great. So this is something that we're really trying to solve for as well, that people want to get out of spreadsheets because we see the massive spreadsheets with a lot of tabs and a lot of data, and they're pretty kind of unwieldy to work with, or there's many spreadsheets as well. And there are definitely better ways to do that. So let's take that step back. We're close to kind of wrapping up here. The main things to really ask yourself. So you feel that you might need to do a materiality assessment. What is your driver? So what is that requirement for doing a materiality assessment? What are the objectives you have in mind? What is the strategic value you might also get out of it? So there might be a clear requirement, but there might also be a lot of strategic value. So use that both to really understand where you're coming from. And that will then inform you about that best approach. So which approach aligns with your current requirements? And as I've flagged, this may change over time. So today it might be, we'll start with a financial materiality assessment because that's what we need to do. We do have ambitions to make that a double materiality assessment, and we'll do that next year, but we just need to start somewhere, and this is a good starting point now. That might be a good approach. But at the same time, it could be with capacity. Right now, we only need to do financial materiality from a requirement, but we see the strategic value. We're in a position to already take that on and do that because it is best practice. We'll get a lot more insights and value out of that assessment. Then ask that question, who's leading, and of course, who's supporting the materiality assessment. So do you have a person who can really drive this effort? Is there internal support? And ask yourself the question as well, do we need external support? And that could be in delivering the materiality assessment. It could also be in helping with that expertise around how the process actually works, or what would be that best approach, helping you uncover your driver. So ask those questions. Finally then, well, almost, is the question around who leads, and does that lead have the relevant expertise? So do you really know what that process involves? So really ask yourself that question, because we've seen from talking to a lot of people that we might talk to companies, oh, we're doing materiality assessments. And when you really get down to it and ask them the questions to uncover how they've done it, so what was your driver? What was your approach you took? We find that it wasn't a materiality assessment at all. It might have been that discretionary captain's call, or it might have been something else. It might have been identifying for TCFD your climate-related risks and opportunities, which is in a way a really small climate-focused, really important exercise, but it's not a full general sustainability materiality assessment. So it's really important to really ask yourself that question, do we know what it is and how it works? And then finally, what tools do you need to deliver on this materiality assessment? So do you have efficient tools and technology to facilitate that process? Now, taking that back then to those three key areas there, of course, we've gone through this many times and we really kind of listen to a lot of people where the problems are. So on those three areas there, we can help you really find the right approach. We can help you get the support you need to understand what you might need to do and how that works then, but also, and I think that's most importantly, where most people struggle is with the tools, the technology. People are really desperate to get out of spreadsheets. We have a dedicated materiality management platform. So what you get is, from an expertise point of view, we can help you find that best approach. Is it financial impact of double materiality? Is there legislation you need to comply with? Or would that look like? And for each one of them, how do you run that then? So get some support there to learn from our experts. Enhance the internal buy-in as well. When you know much better what you need to do, it's a lot easier within the business as well to explain that. Say, well, it's pretty clear now, this is what we have to do. This is how we get additional strategic value out of this exercise. And this is what is required from the business. So in doing that, we often see that leadership then identifies quite quickly, oh, there is strategic value here. So we're now turning a compliance exercise into actually a strategic exercise that will benefit our company a lot more. And then use something that fits your business in terms of how you're running this. And if you do want to kind of move on from spreadsheets, it's really useful to have everything in one place with a clear process to follow and have self-guided technology. So at that final point, people love to get out of the spreadsheets. We can definitely talk to you about how to do that. And with that, I'm going to ask Seth to come back on the stage here and see if there are any questions that have come up that we can go into. And we're always there, of course, to answer your questions. So if you want to learn more about enhancing your materiality assessment, if you're doing them already, or if you're starting that process, make sure that you do talk to us.
Great, thanks, Tim. That was a tremendous amount of information, very informative. So in terms of Q&A, we have one question in the chat, and then I got a couple of questions that were sent to me directly that we'll go through right after. So this is a really great question from Sundus, quite relevant in today's world of sustainability regulations. And Sundus asked, if I conduct a double materiality assessment, would I be able to cover both IFRS S1 and GRI requirements? Further, what materiality assessment would cover broader regulations, California Climate Bill SB 261 and SB 253, which recently was signed into a combined SB 219, and then potentially with the CSSB, that's a Canadian Sustainability Standards Board, for those that don't know that acronym, which is still in more of a proposal stage, I believe following IFRS, and then the SEC, which is currently in litigation. So Tim, over to you. Like, what's your sense of what double materiality would cover?
I love the question. Thanks, Sanders, for that. There's a lot to unpack here. So let's start with IFRS S1 and GRI requirements. So IFRS S1 is general sustainability disclosures. So that really means an IFRS, how they look at things is from a financial materiality point of view. So IFRS S1 is effectively asking you to do a general sustainability materiality assessment, but a financial materiality assessment. So that's on the one side of the coin there. And if you do GRI, you're really looking at impact, so impact materiality. Now, GRI really requires you to get to that level of impacts. to really look at what are the impacts across that value chain. Now with IFRS S1, you need to look at risks and opportunities. So you need to look at, in this case, for IFRS S1 and GRI, it impacts risk and opportunity. So you need to get down to that level where if you do a double materiality assessment, you can't do a very high level stakeholder engagement where you ask a few questions about topics and say, well, we asked a few topical questions. You need to get down to a value chain approach and look at your IRO. So effectively, if you were to do a double materiality assessment that follows the requirements that the Europeans have with CSRD, yes, you will tick the requirements for IFRS S1 and GRI. So first off, yes, you can do that with double materiality assessment, but again, not all double materiality assessments are equal in that sense. So make sure you do one that is broad and deep enough, and any double materiality assessment that is aligned with CSRD will give you the outcomes you're looking for. Now, I'm going to pick out the Canadian standards because effectively the Canadian standards are IFRS S1 and S2. So we're adding there one, and that S2 is on climate. So if we're looking at the Canadian S1 standard, that is IFRS S1. It's the same thing. So if you're just looking for that, then doing an IFRS S1 approach is sufficient. But you're also looking at S2, which is on climate regulation, climate disclosures. Then what we're looking at, that is much closer to the other regulations that we've mentioned here. So that is much closer to the California climate bills, the SEC. It's really about getting into that climate disclosure piece. And what you need to do for that is a very kind of specific focused materiality assessment that is about climate-related financial risks and opportunities. And it's based on TCFD. So what you need to do is across your value chain, look at risks and opportunities that are related. The risks are related to the TCFD physical and transition risks. So they're clearly kind of outlined in TCFD. They also have a category of opportunities there. And you need to look throughout your value chain. Where do those risks and opportunities based on physical climate risk and transition risk, where do they sit? And with that as well, what you often need to do is think about scenario analysis. So think about where the world's going in terms of GHG emissions and the climate's warming. You might have heard of scenarios like there's a 1.5 degree warming scenario and a 2 degree and a 3 degree. And the different scenarios that different international organizations have made. Sometimes jurisdictions have their own requirements there around what scenarios. And you need to look at those risks and opportunities in your value chain and identify which are material, have a financial impact on your organization, but also look at what changes based on those scenarios. So maybe in a 3 degree scenario, it looks very differently, the financial impacts on your business, than in a 1.5 degree scenario. So you need to go through that exercise. Now, if you do technically a CSRD double materiality assessment, and you do that to the letter of the legislation, you would draw that out. But from experience, if we look at what the first companies in Europe have done now, they haven't gone to that level yet. So there is in the European standards, there's a requirement to look at all these things and draw that out in your double materiality assessment. But there's very few companies that have done that as part of their double materiality assessment. They've done it as a separate exercise. So yeah. I realize there's a lot to unpack here, and we're really happy to talk to you about that in more detail in terms of what is applicable to your company, which legislations, what approach do you need to take, and how can you best cover off a lot of these legislations if required.
Yeah, and I think, just adding to that with the SEC, the last version of the SEC proposal did include, and they did want to see more financial materiality as it relates to the SEC proposal, but who knows what will happen with the SEC, and there's still a long way to go as to whether that gets finalized. So, thanks, Tim, for that answer. A couple other questions here. So we got one question that asks, essentially, what are the differences between standard double materiality and CSRD double materiality? And I think just to add to that, it's, we think about standard materiality. I believe what this audience member is asking is more of the topic stakeholder engagement approach to double materiality. So what are the main differences between that kind of approach, more of your historical approach, versus the new CSRD double materiality?
I I think CSRD has really created a very clear expectation about what a double materiality assessment entails. So what do you need to do in that process? Prior to that, we saw a lot of organizations do a financial materiality or an impact materiality, and often impact was a GRI. And GRI is very specific about how that should work as well. And a lot of that work has actually made its way into CSRD's version of double materiality. But what we've seen is that I would say a traditional double materiality, there is not one template for that. Organizations have been doing a variety of things there. And some have done it better than others. If you actually have used the GRI approach and really gone to GRI, really requires you to look at that full value chain and look at impacts there. And if you've added to that approach, a risk and opportunity kind of financial materiality angle as well, you've probably done the right thing there. But if you've really taken more of a high level approach where you just ask a few questions or maybe just keep it really internal, you don't do external engagement, then you're not really covering off the requirements there. So that's always like, it's really hard to really kind of say, what does a traditional double materiality assessment look like? It's relatively new. Companies have been doing it in a variety of ways there, some better than others. So it's really important. I would generally say if you follow the CSRD approach there and do it as they do, you tick most of the requirements. That is really becoming quite quickly not only best practice, but the gold standard for doing a materiality assessment.
Great. And then the last question we got was, my company has never completed a materiality assessment before. Which type of materiality assessment would you recommend for our company in terms of the best practice?
A great question as well. And again, that really depends on those, the drivers. So why are you doing this in the first place? What is the strategic value and the reason that the objectives that you might have in doing this? If there are particular requirements there, then let's follow them. If not, we've seen companies, again, really depending on resources, on where they are, on where they want to land with it, take different approaches there. So it's really hard to give you the right answer there. But we do see that we've seen companies sometimes say, well, we do want to do best practice. Let's do a double materiality assessment. We might not be ready to take on exactly everything that European Union requires there. So we'll do a bit of a pared down version of that to get ready over time there to, operate at that same level. It's not mandatory for us, but we do want to follow or get closer to best practice. We've also seen companies say, well, let's start with an internal version and we'll ask about risk and opportunities. And then later in the year, we're going to do the more kind of externally focused component and really look at the impacts and then try to bring that together into a double materiality assessment. So the variety of approaches there, if there are no legislative requirements or other real requirements on you, you can kind of try to build up that approach there and trying to really kind of, learn as well in that process. I think for a lot of companies, it's really about capacity and capability building, trying to understand this and not make it a third-party exercise where you just get someone to do it for you. This is coming back. This is something you should be doing every year to really get a clear focus on, what you need to do and report on from a sustainability point of view. So it's not a one-off. It's something that you better learn quite quickly how it works. Otherwise, every year you're up for getting a consultant to do the work and you're none the wiser.
And I think you just answered the last question, which was how often should we be running materiality assessments? And I think, as you mentioned, industry best practice and what's being driven from many regulations is really the idea of running an annual materiality assessment. So
yeah. I see one final question from Sanders in terms of the time frame allocated to conducting a deep dive double materiality assessment. I would say if you have not done that type of materiality assessment before, definitely look at 6 months there. It's the first time you're doing that deep dive double materiality. It depends, of course, on your internal capacity. So if you already have a strong sustainability team, they've done different materiality assessments before, they're ready to go, dedicated resources, you'll go a lot quicker. There's still a lot of hard yards to go through and work to do. If you've never done anything, you don't have a team, and it might take more time. But once you've done it the first time, think about if you've mapped your full value chain, if you've done a full register of all those impact risks and opportunities, if you've done all the work, then next year you've done most of that work, you need to validate that work. So the subsequent years might be a lot of less work in terms of you've done a lot of that, the preparation, the foundation is there. You do need to take the time to validate and go through and see if there are major changes in the business. But that first time is definitely, yeah, I would say 6 months on average. Sometimes might be less, sometimes it might be more.
Great, thanks, Tim. All right, let's move on. Just to effectively wrap up here. Oh, we just got someone just asked one last question, so I'll let you answer that, Tim, before we wrap up.
Would you advise to collaborate with auditors once the double materiality assessment is completed or third party? From what we've heard from a lot of practitioners in Europe as well, is that the earlier you engage with your auditor, the better. That's often the case. Now, there are not that many auditors that do this or have a full kind of grip on how it should work, and the auditors are still what we see exploring this space as well. I think that auditors are, quite quickly skilling themselves up and know what is involved with doing a double materiality assessment. But it will benefit you if you understand at the start already what the auditor is looking for. So what is that scope of engagement? What are they looking for? And what auditors mostly look for, and that is really important thing to look for, to understand, is that a materiality assessment might give you in the end an output. And that is, we have a dozen material topics. And with that, we have 30 or 40 material impact risks and opportunities. That's great. But what they're really looking for is, how did you get there? So think about school, when your maths teacher said, great, you got the answer here, but how did you get to that answer? That is what auditors are looking for, a full description of the process. How have you done it? Who was involved? Why did you decide to leave this topic out or put that topic in? Why did you change this? So the full methodology and description. So the earlier you engage with your auditor to understand what they're looking for, the easier it is to have that product and that process documentation in place as well, to make sure that you're not at the end have to retrospectively write everything down. So earlier is better. In terms of helping you understand what's required in a materiality assessment and what that process looks like, yes, third parties can be really beneficial. So, we see a lot of platforms like ourselves or consultants that can help you really understand what are some of the key steps to make sure you're not missing particular components.
Yeah, and I would add that as we move towards an assurance-driven sustainability world, particularly around materiality assessments, technology is going to significantly help with that, and the ability where you can actually track your data, collect the data, and ultimately connect it to the process to show that evidence-based approach to that final material topic. So with that said, to conclude to today's webinar, thanks again, Tim. A couple of takeaways here. On the bottom left is a bit of information about our newsletter list. If you're not subscribed to Social Suite's newsletter, you can go onto our website on www.socialsuitehq.com. At the top, you'll see a banner to sign up to our newsletter. Please do so. And again, as a quick summary about what we do at Social Suite, we help companies ultimately simplify and streamline the materiality assessment process with both our technology and our expert sector-driven advisors. So virtually every industry and sector, we have a dedicated advisor that's a materiality expert, and they use our software to run the materiality assessment. So if you have any questions or interested in running a materiality assessment, please reach out to us. My email's right here, Tim's email's here, and our contact information. Other than that, if you have any other questions from today's webinar, please reach out. And thanks again for joining us, and look out for future webinars from Social Suite. Thanks, everybody.